I'm very delighted to be here. I'm happy to be able to talk to you all about my favorite subject, which is geography, which we'll get to in a little bit. Can I just say that I'm very impressed with the attendance today. I also teach at Portland State University, and if I could get some of my students to attend about half as much as how many people are here, that would be really fantastic. College students, can be a little whimsical with their time these days, or maybe I'm just not as exciting enough. I don't know. I wanted to start out today with showing this map, and I think there was a little handout assignment or something as you guys were mingling. There was a little map that you could sort of look at and sort of take a look at, and you can sort of write on that map sort of what you know. And we're not really going to do anything with that, but it was really just intended to help ground you in sort of the world and sort of how you think about the world, because the way in which you interpret maps and interpret the world is based a lot on your culture, it's based on your identity, it's based on your education, it's based on a lot of different things. But as we're going to find out today, and contrary almost a little bit to what the month's theme is, the world is very, very complicated. But we can simplify it, right? And we can simplify it mostly through the power of maps. And so I wanted to start out with this map. This is a very famous map of the world. And actually, I'm going to try and move a little bit over here just so other people can see me occasionally. And I'll try and bounce back and forth, but this column is going to be an issue. But I wanted to start with this map because this map is very problematic. But this is also probably the most common map that you've probably seen in the world. And there's a lot of big issues with this. And the biggest one that I would say is that it distorts the actual size of our world. I don't know how many people know this, but Greenland is not nearly that size. It's not even half that size. It's not even a fifth of that size. But this map has distorted it so that it looks like it's the size of Africa. And perhaps what it's done even worse is that it's made Africa feel very small. And that might not seem like it matters all that much, but to people who are from Africa and for people who are making maps, this makes them seem a little more diminished than the actual world might actually have them be. And so that's important because, as we're going to talk about later in this presentation, maps are power. And that's something that I want everybody to take away from today, is that maps have a lot of power to them. They offer a lot of legitimacy and authority to whoever's making the map. And so we have to be very critical about where those maps are coming from and who's making them and why they've been made in the first place. But first, let's take it back a little bit and let's talk a little bit about the world at large. I already talked about sort of the theme of this month, which is simplicity. And sort of what I'm doing today is I'm going to talk a lot about maps because maps will help us understand the world. They can be very powerful, they can be deceitful, but they can also be used in ways that help us just better understand what's happening in the world. And more to that point, and the reason why I'm here and the reason why I'm talking to you today is because I love geography. I love it so much because while you can have a subject such as physics, which explains basically how things happen, you can have geology, which explains sort of the rocks that are underneath us. You can have calculus, which explains sort of, I don't know. I actually don't know what calculus explains because I didn't major in calculus. But what geography does is it takes the millions of billions of trillions of things that are happening on this planet and on any given second of any given hour of any given day of any given year, and it allows us to simplify it and understand it and how all of those things are connected. Geography is, if nothing else, is a spatial science. It allows us to figure out why is something happening here and not here. And I love geography because that's the way that I've been able to interpret the world for a variety of reasons that we're going to sort of run through. And I just want to be upfront that about the first third of this presentation is going to be a little bit about my background, how I sort of came to be and do what I do today. And then the last part is going to be kind of a lecture that's going to be about maps. And I'm sorry about that, but you are talking to a teacher at Portland State University as well. So, and this is obviously just a representation of the world. This is not an actual view of the world right now. I don't have that power. I did want to briefly talk about, this is a video thumbnail for a video that I've created, and geography is a way to not only help us understand sort of what's happening in the world, but it can help us understand why things aren't happening in certain places compared to others. And so this is a map or a video that I did that I called America's Empty Belt. And just a quick call out that this is also the historic lands of the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, the Sioux, the Lakota, and many, 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 many more tribes that were forcibly removed from this land. It is now part of the United States and part of a series of different states there. And if you're unfamiliar with this area of the U.S., this is an area that has about 12% of the entire landmass that the U.S. owns, but it has less than 1%. And I put 1% here because that's easy for people to grasp, but it actually has less than 1% of the U.S. population. That's a massive amount of area that not a lot of people live in. And so this video ended up going on to sparking people's interest and ended up going on to, I think, has something around 5 million views because it sparks that question. Why aren't people living here? You'll have to watch the video. I'm not going to go through the video here for you all. But I wanted to show it because this is sort of an illustration of what geography can help us understand. So let's talk a little about who I am, because I'm up here talking to you all, and you all made the time out of your morning to come here. So my name is Geoff. That's me. And I run a very popular YouTube channel called Geography by Geoff. This was something that I started a little while ago that we'll get to in a minute, but I also run a podcast and a Substack newsletter called Geography is Everything, and that's with my colleague, Hunter Shobi. He's a professor of geography at Portland State University. And these are two things that sort of we were able to start and start to build a community around and start to get people interested in geography and start to tell stories around the world of why things are happening. And so to this day, I have, it's a little outdated, I have about 275,000 subscribers on YouTube. And I have a lot of videos that come out every single week, and people are able to subscribe and sort of learn about sort of different places around the world. And so this is me at 16. And yeah, I don't know what you are all taking away from this photo. I think the one thing that I take away from this photo is that this is not a person to me, and I can tell you that it's true, that jumps out as a very studious person, somebody who does well in school, who really cares about a career, who's thinking about college. I didn't think about any of these things. You know what I was thinking about at this time? I think I was 16. I was thinking about what was happening in my local venue, my local place that I went to go watch music, which was a place called Chain Reaction. And if I'm being really honest, where I was going to find beer that weekend. But during that time, I happened to live in a place called Los Angeles, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. We're not that far away from it. And I know LA is not Portland's favorite transplant location, although that might have changed in the recent year as we don't have as many people moving to Portland. But when I first moved here, people didn't really like the fact that I was from LA. But it's an integral part of my story and sort of how I ended up where I am today. Because when I was living in LA, I moved around a lot. I moved around 20 times. And actually, it's not just in LA that I lived. I lived down in San Diego a little bit. I even lived as far north as Anchorage, Alaska. I moved constantly, every single year, going to a different place and new school and all that fun stuff. And this became very important because in LA, which is a massive city, it's much bigger than the Portland metro area, when you move from here, which is, if you're familiar with the LA area, about Northridge, Van Nuys area, northern LA, to here, Long Beach, it becomes very important to figure out where were you in relation to where you are now, right? Now, LA is a quagmire of freeways. They crisscross the entire metro area. Figuring out how you're going to, one place to the other, you're going to take the 5 to the 405 to the 10 to the 55 to the whatever, all that kind of fun stuff, myriad of numbers of freeways and freeways and freeways. It becomes very important to spatially figure out where you are in relation to where you've been. And so I did this a lot of different times. And I became very attuned to maps. In fact, so good that I'm still very, very good at directions. It is uncanny that I can go to some place basically once in any city around the world, and I can basically find myself back in that location without any sort of map, just from pure memory. It's something that I've internalized just growing up. And this, I know I look young, but this was before Google Maps. I didn't have a Google Maps. I think MapQuest might have been a thing, if anybody here remembers what MapQuest is. But I didn't have a computer, so kind of a moot point. We certainly didn't have all these, handy doodads, these little computers inside our pockets that could get us from point A to point B with little to no effort. So I had to figure all this out myself using something called Thomas Guides, which is, there you go, all the groans. Yeah, you're all familiar with it. Here, I'll switch back over here so that, again, people can see me. So in 2009, I moved up to Portland. And I moved up to Portland to attend Portland State University. Woo, go Vikes. And I very quickly honed in on geography as the subject that I wanted to learn. Now, if anybody here were to ask me if I did any sort of career searching, what careers could come out of a degree in geography, I would tell you no. I did not look at that at all. In fact, if I had, I probably would have been dismayed at the results because as it turns out, there's not a lot of people hiring geographers. It's just not a profession that you'll find. If you go on Indeed.com and you type in geographer, boy, it's slim pickings right there. But I did. I went to Portland State University. I got my degree in geography. And then I graduated and I sort of worked around town a little bit. I think I worked in some service locations, again, geography. But what it did was it helped me figure out that I love also cities. And so I went back in 2015 and I got my master's degree in urban and regional planning at Portland State again. And there's actually a lot more jobs in urban and regional planning. So I was able to find a job, and from about 2017 to earlier this year, I worked as a city planner, a city transportation planner right here in the city. And I've worked on a number of projects that you've probably all felt pretty intimately as you traverse through the metro area. Some of them that you probably aren't going to be super happy about, but and I'm sorry, but it is what it is. But then 2020 happened. 2020 was a monumental year, and I think everybody knows why. COVID-19. And COVID-19 was a really big deal for everybody, and not in a good way. I'm not saying that this was a really big deal for everybody in a good way. In fact, for most people, it was pretty bad. And like most people, I was filled with fear, anxiety, a general discomfort at not knowing what was happening and sort of when everything was going to happen. But mostly, guys, I was so bored. I was so bored. Prior to 2020, I was involved in professional organizations. I had a wide range of social activity. I loved watching the NBA. I loved watching MLS, Go Timbers. All of that stuff stopped. They even took away our sports, right? Not they, but COVID. It should have been taken away, obviously. But the point is that there was just not that much to do. And so I sort of returned to one of my first loves, which was making maps. Something that I had learned to do in geography when I was an undergrad, something I did as a profession as a city planner. City planners make a lot of maps, if you didn't know that. And so I made maps. I made maps about where the biggest art heists of the world are. I made maps of Cascadia, the bioregion of the Pacific Northwest. It's a fun little illustrated map. I made maps of the 2021 drought in Oregon. If you were around here in 2021, you can probably remember that it was pretty bad. In fact, it led to one of the worst fires later that year that we've ever experienced. I don't know if anybody remembers the smoke for a week. Still makes me cringe a little bit thinking about it. I made maps of city names around the country. And this is a map here that's of all the cities that start with Port versus all the cities that start with Fort. Guys, I was really bored, all right? I cannot stress that enough. And like any good millennial, I also made maps of the housing price increase around the country because, I was slowly seeing my dreams of owning property slip away as places shot up 30%, 28%, 40%. I think Portland was about 22%, I can't remember. All that's to say is I made so many maps. I've made so many maps during this time. It's about a 2-year period during sort of 2020 to early 2022 that I will go online, I will go on whatever social media platform, and I will see a map that has been shared, not by me, by somebody else. And I will only later realize after I look at it, I'm like, oh, this is a really cool map. I'm like, oh, I made this map. And so one thing I did as I sort of hit 2022, late 2021, is I started to think about all these maps that I made, and sharing them was really fun. And I started to think, well, this has been really cool, but static maps can only do so much. And in fact, you're actually leaving up a lot of the power to tell a story into the person who's reading it at any given time. What they're taking away from it can be something wildly different from what you intended. And so I knew that in order to keep progressing, I wanted to get into sort of video and film and storytelling and motion graphics and doing all that kind of stuff. So in January 2022, I launched my very first video, which is this video right here. And it's about the power of population density. And this video goes on to explain that if every single human being on the planet, all 8 billion of us, lived in a single city with the population density of San Francisco, we could all live in a city that's the size of Texas. The rest of the world, completely empty of humans. That's the power of population density, right? I'm glad you were all wowing about that because it's actually still one of my lowest viewed videos. It did not do very well. I think it has like 9,600 views right now. But that's okay because I would go on to make a lot more videos. In fact, I would make videos that really talk about where people are living and sort of how they're living there. And so I would rack up millions of views talking about these places. And this sort of theme really hit out at people is why are people not living here? Why are people living there? The end result is that just talking about issues and sort of geography and presenting it in a way that's easily digestible and being able to tell a story, most of all, has been the thing that people, I think, have really gravitated towards. My maps and geography in general. In fact, geography YouTube is not just me. I would love to say that I'm the only geographer on YouTube making videos, but there's actually a lot of people making videos of similar sort of content and everything like that. And people gobble up these videos because the world's an interesting place. And all of those millions of billions of trillions of things happening at every hour, second, whatever, we can explain sort of how that's all happening through geography. And so let's talk. All right, we're done with the portion where I'm talking about myself. Now you're going to get the lecture part. So let's talk a little bit about how maps simplify our world. So we're going to go through some maps. We'll go through about 3 of these, and I've put a little thing here that says how many maps we're going to talk about, so you're not sort of wondering when this is going to end. Let's talk about how maps simplify our world, because as I said in the beginning, this is exactly what maps are designed for. They're designed to take a very complicated place and slap a single sort of theme to it, to have you understand what's happening at any given point in a spatial manner. And so, actually, who's here familiar with this map? I'm going to call on somebody right here. What is this map of? I mean, obviously, it's... There you go. It's the capitals. If you were educated here in the United States, you went through elementary school, you probably, at some point in your elementary school journey, you looked at a map that looked just like this, and you probably had a test on it, which was what state has what capital, right? What are the state capitals? And that's probably where your geography journey began and ended. Because that's what the American school system sort of like teaches, unless you go into geography in college like I did. But I wanted to show it because it's a map that sort of starts that process of how we're simplifying our world. Obviously, everything on this map is not actually being presented. Everything that's actually happening within the state of California or the state of Oregon, for example, is not being represented on this map. In fact, it's really only representing a single thing, which is, actually I would say 2 things, the boundary of Oregon and the capital of Oregon. But we can do this in a lot of different ways, right? This is a map of, the world. This is what we call an aerial map of the world. It's probably showing sort of the realistic-ish conditions of it, but it's still not quite there. So let's keep on moving here. Here's a map that probably most people are familiar when they do look at maps. You take a look at your old atlas, or you open up a National Geographic and there's a map in there that's showing something. Oftentimes they are political maps, right, where the political boundaries fall, where they... where does Russia end and China begin, for example? Where does Nairobi end and South Africa begin? All that kind of stuff. These sort of maps are very common. This is sort of how we mostly interpret our world. But then we can get a little bit more complicated with it, but still simplifying the world, but still more complicated. Does anybody know what this map is of? Climate. Yeah, it's the climate. This is, there's a whole system of classifications that we use called the Köppen climate method of determining climate across geographies. And you can see, and this is, I would say the Sahara was probably the big giveaway that this was about climate, because it's right there, it's red, that means it's hot, it's dry. But this is a way that we can determine, okay, what's happening around the world in terms of the weather? What are the places that are sharing similar sort of climate biomes? This one's gonna get a little harder. Does anybody know what this is a map of? Elevation. I don't know who said elevation, but this is a map of elevation, right? So there's nothing else on this map. This is just a map that's showing the wide range of elevation going from basically black or maybe the absence of anything there, which means that it's basically at sea level or below sea level, to very white, which would be something that's very high up. And so obviously the Himalayas and the Tibetan highlands stands out pretty prominently here. But you can also see the Rocky Mountains, you can see the Andes, you can see the European Alps, all that fun stuff. And so all of these maps, what they do is they just help us to simplify the world in ways that we can digest it in it's sort of an easy to understand manner. And really what they all are representations of our world, right? So none of these maps that I just ran through, none of these are our world. And that's an important concept to understand when you are looking at maps, when you are being trained to look at maps, and when you're trained to critique maps. None of these are actually our world. And the reason why I want to say that and emphasize that is because oftentimes people will look at a map and they will assume that what's on that map is true. They will assume that what's happening on that map is factual. All of these maps that I've shown you could be wrong, and you would have no way of knowing it. You've just taken sort of what it is, and you've probably assumed that, oh yes, the Sahara is a big dry area, so yes, that is true. It is. That is true. But really, they're just simply representations of our world. And so we need to sort of think about what that means and sort of how that progressed. And I'm gonna wrap this up in a bow here. I'm not sort of scattered here, but we're gonna do this by going back in time a little bit, because maps are also not new. We've been making maps for thousands of years. In fact, oops, wrong way. In fact, if we go all the way back to, I think this is circa, do I have it here in my notes here, 1400 BCE, this was sort of one of the very first maps that has ever been found. It's a map of, again, let me look at my notes, a Babylonian city of Nippur, and it's starting to show rudimentary sort of ways that people were starting to map out sort of their place. Now, for the people, the Babylonians living here, their world probably wasn't that big. And so this was probably all they really needed to know. But let's jump ahead a few centuries, and we get to something like this. This is one of the very first recorded world maps. This was done by Anaximander, still around 500 BCE. Now, obviously, this has been interpreted into English. You know, Anaximander was not writing in English. However, this is an interpretation of it, and you can kind of see that, you know, even from a very early age, that the representation of the world was starting to get a little more accurate. Or at least, you know, factually, you know, places were lining up with generally where they were. So you have the Mediterranean. You can even see Italy there. In fact, I don't know where Anaximander was from, but based on the amount of detail given to Italy, you can probably assume that he was probably from Italy. There's Europe. There's Asia, which is just a big old blob over there. And then there's Libya, which is sort of what they termed Africa way back then. And if we jump ahead again a couple more centuries, we can see that the representation of our world gets a little bit more defined. Things are getting a little bit more accurate. And so now the Mediterranean and Italy are, you know, getting a lot more precise. This is now done by Hecataeus. But Hecataeus is building off of Anaximander's map. Libya is now pretty, or Egypt, I say, is right there, along with the Nile River. Asia, Turkey, you know, these places that we commonly refer to today are starting to get a little bit more shape. And so all of this stuff is starting to come together. The representation of our world is starting to grow and starting to expand, and people are getting a better understanding of what's actually out there, and they're able to more accurately map it. And so if we jump ahead a few more centuries, we get to something a little more like this. This is actually a picture of the actual map. This hasn't been remade like the other two. And this is from Ptolemy. It's one of the very first Ptolemaic world maps that he designed himself. And now you can kind of see, and I'll jump over here really quick. You can kind of see that this is Europe, and you can kind of see there's the Iberian Peninsula. Italy, again, is getting a little bit more defined. You can see the Mediterranean is a little bit more defined. Everything is getting a lot more, for lack of a better term, realistic, right? Everything's getting a lot more accurate. Something that you, with all of the mapping technology we have today, would say, oh yeah, that looks vaguely familiar. Now, again, this is all done way before satellites, obviously. This was done before there was any sort of technology to really help people understand how the world looked, but they were able to start figuring it out through centuries of iteration, building upon maps, and starting to get at something that maybe looks a little bit more like an actual place. Still very wrong, though. Don't get me wrong. And so we jump back ahead a few more centuries, and this is the very first map I showed today. This is actually a map called the Mercator projection, or it's a Mercator map. And this is the map that most of you were probably first introduced to in terms of a world map. A social studies book probably had a map that was of this projection. And this is the map that's, again, this, as I talked about earlier, it's the one that leads people to believe that Greenland is larger or at least the size of Africa, which is horribly wrong. It leads to people thinking that the state of Alaska in the U.S. is the size of half of the continental U.S. or contiguous U.S., which is absolutely not true. It's definitely not that big. It's about twice the size of Texas. But this is the map that's the one that's carried on through history more so than any other map. And it's because during the colonial period of discovery of ships going across the ocean to the quote-unquote New World. It was actually quite old. It had been here for a long time. This was the map that allowed people sailing across the ocean to navigate towards their destination with the greatest ease. But of course, those of us in the geography field no longer like this map, and so we like this. We like this. This is a map. It's called the Robinson map or Robinson projection map. And everything, again, gets a little bit more accurate. Now, of course, now we can kind of see, okay, Greenland, much smaller. Africa, much larger. Actually correct. Alaska, much smaller. Now, of course, things get distorted in a way, right? Because you can kind of see the curvature of the Earth. And that's kind of the point, right? Because maps, again, are not the actual world. They are representations of the world. And so when you try and put a map on a flat surface, things get distorted. And so now we have something that's very nice and very lovely, which is Google Earth. If you ever played around with it, you can sort of go in, you can zoom in, you can scroll out, and you see this nice globe feel. And obviously we've had globes throughout the last 500 years or so that more accurately predict the world and give you a very, I would say, accurate spatial depiction of the world. But this is a really fun one that you can explore on your own. And it's because of tools like this that we are now getting a more accurate representation of our world. Something that has never been possible up until about 20 years ago. And so we've talked a lot about maps and how they simplify our worlds. And what I always want to end up on is something that I usually go through in my very first class with any sort of new geography class that I'm teaching. It doesn't really matter what the actual subject's going to be. But it's that maps are very problematic. And I've sort of hinted at this through the presentation today. And that is because they are authoritative. And so let's look at this map. This is a map of Africa, obviously. And if you're not able to see, I'll sort of walk people through it, but this is a map of colonial holdings in Africa. And so you can kind of see up here, it says French territory. You can see Belgian Congo down here. You can see Union of South Africa, which was owned by the British. I think there's German in there. The color's a little washed out. But the point is that at some point, the European powers that be at the time got together in a room. They laid out a big map of Africa, and then they started carving it up. Who is going to own what in Africa? Now, do you think any of the people who actually lived here were at that table? No, absolutely not. But they didn't have the power, right? Right at that time, the European countries were far and away the most powerful entity the world had ever seen. They had more wealth, more guns, more of everything than any other country. And so they could do this. And so they did do this. And when they drew these lines, that's what happened. That became what actually happened. This became French territory. In fact, a lot of people in this area of the French territory, it's what we call the Sahel area, they speak French. I mean, they speak their local native language as well, but they speak French due to this history of people carving up maps. And we can do this not just with Africa, but also with the United States, right? And so map's a little wonky. Some of the wording got a little messed up. I'm not sure what happened when I turned this into a picture, but I'll walk you through it again, right? So we have the United States. This was an area that was ceded from Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 after the U.S. won its war for independence. And then very quickly after, it bought this big white area. Does anybody know what that area is called? Louisiana Purchase. Yeah, I think we all got that history lesson in school. They bought it for a very small sum of $15 million. Quite a lot of money, but still probably way less than it should have cost. And again, nobody asked any of the Native Americans whether they were selling their land. They bought it from France, a country that never really had much of a presence anywhere in here, and they did have New Orleans down there. But it was theirs on a map. And therefore, the U.S. entered into negotiations with that country and bought it, and then proceeded to slowly but surely wipe out all of the tribes that are in the area, either by force or some other nefarious mean. This happened time and time again. Texas, Alta California, Oregon Territory, where we're at, again, was a treaty by way of with Great Britain, again, to figure out sort of where the lines were going to get drawn. And so, again, here's a map of the linguistic tribes of the region. And I'm going to jump through this really quick because I know I'm running a little bit light on time. But I wanted to end this on one last map, or actually two last maps. This is a map of Imperial Russia. It is I think it's dated from 1730. So it's the extent of the Russian Empire at the time. And I want to call out one little thing right down here, which is Ukraine. This was a time when Ukraine was formerly part of the Imperial Russian area. And because of this map, not only solely because of this map, but partly used as justification, we get something like this, which is the Russian-Ukraine war started in 2022, is still going on today, and stuff like that is being used, these old maps are being used as justification for why Russia deserves to own Ukraine, because it was once theirs, because somebody at some point put it on a map that was part of the Russian Empire, and that is something that we collectively as human beings, we lend authority to, we lend authenticity to, we give that power to maps. And so this becomes very dangerous because now there's actual, right, as we've seen through history, but this is very recent, right? There's a war going on right now that's kind of precipitated by some old maps, by the Russian government today, assuming that they own this territory because the Russian Empire in 1730 did. And to be honest, I don't know in 1730 whether they actually owned that land, but they put it on a map, and that's what matters. And so with that, I'm going to end the presentation because, again, I think I'm running out of time here. And do we have time for a Q&A? Okay. So I'll open it up to questions. Again, if you want to find me around, you can just Google one of these two things and you'll find me.